There's nothing like a comfy chair and an engrossing book, as Heather Mashak's 12-inch porcelain afternoon fantasy suggests. Heather says she has just reached the steamy part. Characters from books, especially children's books, classics, and Shakespeare, have been popular subjects for doll artists. In the 50s and 60s, NIADA founder Helen Bullard carved a number of 7-inch Hitties in wood. Hitty, her first 100 years, was a 1930 Newbery Prize-winning book about a little wooden doll. Although numerous other wood artists have made variations on Hitty, Helen's jointed wooden figures with an Appalachian flavor are coveted by collectors. Another wood artist, Patty Hale, also did an edition of Hitties in her own style with her signature round faces. These dolls were among her smallest, a little over 6 inches tall. Patty did all her carving with X-Acto knives using wood of Malaysian rubber trees. Nancy Drew was another heroine who appeared in 1930, and the ghost-written books have inspired generations of girls. Robert Tonner Doll Company manufactures the clever girl detective in vinyl and designs fashionable clothing she wears while solving crimes. Heather Mashak's red-headed Lexi was her choice for Anne of Green Gables. In typical scatterbrain Anne style, she has lost her straw hat. Lexi is porcelain, 8 inches tall, and debuted in 2009. Peter in Blueberry Land from a Swedish story inspired these 7-inch dolls Heather did for a 2006 UFDC event. Peter travels to Blueberry Land, where he meets the Cranberry Girls and the Blueberry Boys. Leslie Keeble created a doll for a library exhibit in North Carolina based on the award-winning Miss Hickory, a favorite childhood book of Leslie's. The small doll made of twigs had heroic adventures in the woods. Leslie's updated Miss Hickory suggests her hickory nut head without copying the original illustrations. Nancy Walters' number 17 Cherry Tree Lane from the early 90s depicts Mary Poppins being blown in on the east wind. The 17-inch magical English nanny is paper clay. R. John Wright's felt dolls are based on the original illustrations from Winnie the Pooh. Jody and Richard Krieger created the 9-inch Christopher Robin in 2009. He and Pooh are sculpted in polymer clay. Pooh's bearskin Buckingham Guards hat is made of rabbit skin from a very old stuffed cat Jody had from childhood, another example of the sacrifices doll artists make. Heather Mashak's Tenshi was sculpted in memory of the Japanese child in the book Sadako and the Thousand Cranes. Developing leukemia as a result of the Hiroshima bomb, she believed she could be cured if she could fold 1,000 cranes. Although she died at age 12, her statue is festooned with thousands of origami cranes created by children from all over Japan. 11-inch Teshi has a 5-piece porcelain body and was made in 2002. The Big Wash by Russian artist Anna Zueva was inspired by the verses of Sasha Chorny, a Russian poet, satirist, and children's writer. The 2010 paper clay doll is 14 inches tall. In the poem, a little boy who doesn't like to wash gets so dirty that his toys, books, and clothes decide to run away. Chased by a vicious sponge, the boy is then convinced of the virtues of cleanliness. Austrian artist Sylvia Natterer has made several versions of The Little Prince, the most read and translated book in the French language. The boy prince recounts the story of his life, falling in love with a rose on his small home volcanic asteroid and later coming to Earth. The white and gold Little Prince was made for the NIADA Challenge, the golden one. Another, with a plant growing out of one of the asteroid's volcanoes, provides a resting spot for snails in Sylvia's garden. Heather Mashak's 2006 Le Petit Dauphin is 7 inches tall and all porcelain with painted eyes and a caracal lambskin wig. He wears ultra-suede boots and a knit jumpsuit under his elegant wool felt coat. The wizard from Frank Baum's The Wizard of Oz is portrayed here by Susanna Oroyan. The doll is polymer clay and was done in the early 80s. Dorothy from the Land of Oz by Ukrainian artist Tamara Pivniuk is another one of her dolls in their After the Book Grown-Up Lives. Her Gone with the Wind dolls were exhibited in St. Petersburg in 2009. Dorothy is polymer clay and stands about 21 inches tall. Here with Dorothy is a grown-up Alice in Wonderland from the same group. Alice and Friends have inspired many NIADA artists, including Nancy Wiley and Stephanie Blythe. There are so many of these dolls that they will be featured in a separate program. Although best known for porcelain, Suzanne Gibson produced some dolls in felt. One was Little Black Sambo, the Indian boy who outwitted 4 hungry tigers. The dual 18 inches in porcelain by Nancy Walters is from the poem about the gingham dog and the calico cat. Created in 1992, this dog and cat didn't eat each other up as in the poem, they just tore the stuffing out of each other. Susanna Arroyan's Pied Piper from the 80s was done in polymer clay and is accompanied by felt mice that he lured from Hamelin with his magic pipe. June Goodnow's polymer clay piper is from the end of the story. The town refused to pay the piper, so he led the children away from their pleading parents. Peter and Wendy by Robert Tonner are from the children's classic Peter Pan. Cloth doll artist Mirren Berry, who later worked in paper, made Peter and Tinkerbell as a convention souvenir in 1984. Also in the 80s, Lisa Lichtenfeld sculpted Peter and Wendy in Peter's home in Neverland. Wendy could be quite firm with Peter and the Lost Boys, but she looks not quite so determined as the angry, jealous fairy perched on the thimble that Peter thought was a kiss. The tiny Tinkerbell was sculpted in polymer clay. E.J. Taylor's 22-inch Captain Hook was done for a friend who plays Hook in a London Christmas pantomime. The head is polymer clay and he is dressed in vintage textiles, including a hand-quilted waistcoat. The actor has bequeathed Hook to the Ormond Street Children's Hospital, which was given the rights to Peter Pan by J.M. Barrie. Numerous NIADA artists have a background in puppetry and theatrical design that influences their work. These are construction photos of Scott Gray's Crocodile and Nana for Peter Pan at the Seattle Children's Theater. The toy maker Geppetto and the marionette Pinocchio were carved in wood by Patricia Brooks in the 1980s. Susanna Arroyan's Geppetto also dates from the 80s. Canadian puppeteer and marionette maker Arlen Code titled this piece The Toy Maker, but the wooden carving in his hand so resembles Pinocchio that we might assume it represents the little wooden boy. We see that Cindy Moyer's Pinocchio has begun telling lies. He is all fabric construction except for his wire and paper nose. His jacket, pants, and hat were designed using specialty cotton, and he rides atop an early version of a skateboard that tests his balance. Self-indulgent Mr. Toad from Wind in the Willows stole a car, drove recklessly, and was jailed. Charles Batt depicted his escape dressed as a washerwoman. Mr. Toad, 17 inches tall, is polymer clay, painted with acrylics and dressed in cotton and wool. R. John Wright's felt brother and sister from Hans Brinker, or the Silver Skates, wanted to enter an ice skating race but had only wooden skates. The Swiss girl Heidi is also felt by early NIADA artist Herta Foster. Herta also made numerous figures with composition heads and porcelain dolls to go in her miniature rooms. Gwen Flather also made her version of Heidi in cloth. Another favorite classic is Stevenson's Treasure Island. The Kriegers created this 12-inch polymer clay piece in 1997. Jody believes the doll looks so much like her father because it was the first one they made after her father's death. Hailey Blakely worked in cloth, then fabric-covered composition, and finally in high-fired clay, and was known for detailed period costuming. These dolls from Little Women appear to be compo and cloth, probably from the 1960s. Astrid Campbell settled on porcelain after trying other media, and these Little Women dolls are porcelain. Astrid also designed dolls for manufacturers. Renee Harrison's Little Women dolls date from about 1965 and are around 15 inches tall. Her dolls had porcelain heads, hands, and feet with stuffed muslin bodies. Lita Wilson's Marmee is porcelain, probably made in the late 70s. Lita especially liked sculpting fictional characters and portraits of famous people. A series by Maggie Head Kane is this group of characters from Tom Sawyer, including a Mark Twain figure. Huckleberry Finn and Tom are 16 inches tall. Maggie dressed and even painted the characters differently. Maggie Head Kane was a prolific doll maker and master mold maker who taught at national ceramic shows and in her own studio. The series, including Becky and Aunt Polly, dates from the early to mid-70s. Herbert Vanek, also a porcelain doll artist, did this version of Tom Sawyer, 15 inches tall, in 1971. Many Moons by James Thurber tells the story of a princess who thinks she can only be cured of her illness if she is given the moon. All of Shelley Thornton's dolls have needle-sculpted faces with embroidered features and feature her signature cloth-constructed stuffed hair. Pippi Longstocking, about 12 inches tall, was sculpted in air-drying clay in 1997 by Russian doll artist Ima Naroditskaya. Pippi and her horse Ole are characters from a popular series of Swedish books. The Texas Association of Original Doll Artists did traveling storybook exhibits to libraries in the Houston area for 10 years. Neva Walt's 16-inch cloth over paper clay Dancing Granny was done for the 2010 exhibit. Neva created this cloth over paper clay doll for the 2009 exhibit. Miss Nancy was the favorite of a little boy who lived next door to an old people's home. Amelia Bedelia was a housekeeper whose literal interpretations got her into trouble. For instance, drawing the drapes involved pencil and paper. Neva's 12-inch Amelia from 2011 has dressed the turkey in a printed vest. Since Amelia is smaller than Neva usually works, her face and hands are painted, not skinned in cloth. Cousin Laszlo for the 2006 exhibit is one of Neva's few polymer clay dolls. After obtaining the author's permission to use his image, she sent him a photo of the doll. While working with Disney on the animated film Meet the Robinsons, the author invited Neva to exhibit the piece along with the Disney art at the Shreveport Children's Museum, one of 6 artists invited. Another artist who participated in the Texas group's library exhibits was Karen Otto Burdick. In 2010, Dickens' David Copperfield was her subject. The doll is polymer clay and is about 18 inches tall. Dora Copperfield, David's frail and childlike wife, was created in the 80s by Susanna Arroyan. Scottish-born cloth doll artist Muireann Barry created Oliver Twist and Mr. Bumble. Her dolls are known for their carefully researched clothing. From Great Expectations, we have Miss Havisham by Susanna Arroyan. The aging spinster is about 14 inches tall and was sculpted in polymer clay in the early 80s. This Miss Havisham by Robert McKinley was done in polymer clay in the mid-80s. Bob sculpted 4 versions of Miss Havisham, still in the wedding gown she wore from the day she was jilted. The second was also polymer clay and was about 22 inches tall. The second and a similar third were done in the late 1980s. Bob's final Miss Havisham was the smallest, 14 inches tall, in paper clay. This Miss Havisham is the one he said he always wanted to do. Very, very angry. Probably the favorite of all the Charles Dickens tales is A Christmas Carol. Charter member of NIADA, Deweese Cochran, did her Dickens series with this 11-inch latex Tiny Tim around 1955. This cloth Tiny Tim is by Muireann Barry. Gwen Flather also made Tiny Tim along with his mother and his father Bob Cratchit, probably about 6 to 8 inches tall. Gwen said that her needle sculpting skills came from darning socks. Susanna Arroyan's polymer clay Bob Cratchit with the Christmas goose was done in the early 80s. Jody and Richard Krieger's Scrooge, also polymer clay, is a 1-inch to the foot scale miniature standing about 5 3/4 inches tall, and the Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come is about 7 inches. The tombstone is carved from wood. Jacob Marley, Scrooge's deceased business partner, is about 6 inches tall. The strong boxes are carved wood, and the books are some of the first mini-books the Kriegers made. Gail Lackey did not design her 2003 doll after the tormented Dickens ghost. The name came to her after he was done. About 12 inches tall, Marley's ghost is polymer clay painted in oils and wears a suit made from an 1800s piece of mourning fabric. Susanna Arroyan's lesser character from A Christmas Carol, the cheerful Mrs. Fezziwig, is polymer clay and about 14 inches tall. American author Washington Irving may be most famous for his tale of Sleepy Hollow, featuring the gawky schoolmaster Ichabod Crane. Nancy Walters' Ichabod was sculpted in porcelain clay about 1993 and stands 24 inches tall. Nancy's much smaller Irving figure, Rip Van Winkle, would be 12 inches tall if he awoke from his long nap, and was also sculpted in porcelain clay about a year after Ichabod. Don Quixote was modeled after Deborah Pope's father, who loved opera and classical music, and also the Man of La Mancha. She looked for ways to make the piece relate to the process of getting older with dignity and grace, not just for her father, but for all of us. Her needle-felted doll wears a leather vest and is colored with brushed-on pastels. His hat is topped with a miniature windmill. Cindy Moyer's Gift of the Magi depicts the young wife selling her hair to buy her husband a watch fob for Christmas, not knowing that her husband has sold his watch to buy combs for her long hair. The doll is all fabric with a soft sculpted face, stiffened and skinned with a layer of cotton gauze. Her skirt is hand-dyed silk velvet, and her lace top created from a vintage doily. Tanya Marriott wanted to depict a Byronic hero, someone perfect as a hero but flawed as a person. She chose Edward Rochester for her subject, accompanied by Jane Eyre. Edward and Jane are dressed in appropriate period costumes. Tanya represented Edward by a raven and Jane by a blue dove. The protagonist in Pride and Prejudice, Elizabeth Bennet, is polymer clay by Marta Finch Kozlowski. Robert McKinley's The Hag of Bear, from a 10th century Irish poem about an aged courtesan, dates from 1985. 12 inches high, her hands are the first Bob ever sculpted in polymer clay. His previous hands were cloth and spackling. 2 stanzas from the poem are on a parchment on her base. Bilbo Baggins, a respectable hobbit from Middle-earth, was done in polymer clay by Susanna Arroyan in the early 80s. In the late 80s, Nancy Walters did another character from the Tolkien books, the wizard Gandalf the Grey, 36 inches tall and in porcelain clay. Another of Nancy's wizards from that time, the 30-inch tall Merlin, lifelong advisor to King Arthur, from The Once and Future King, is also porcelain clay. Merlin is accompanied by his companion Archimedes the Owl. Bob McKinley was a fan of artist-writer Edward Gorey. Bob's 15-inch paper clay, The Gilded Bat, is based on the woeful, gory tale of a peculiar girl named Maudie who became a mysterious ballerina. Shakespeare created a wealth of material that has inspired much visual art. Stephanie Blythe's porcelain 73rd sonnet was created in 1996. Shelley Thornton's Juliet is cloth. Shelley's dolls are usually 25 to 27 inches tall. Bodies are stuffed with wool and have wooden ball joints and wired fingers. This Juliet by Robert McKinley was done in the early 80s. Polymer clay, she stood 22 inches tall and made her debut appearance in a group of window displays Bob designed for the Fifth Avenue jewelry store Tiffany & Company, along with Kate from The Taming of the Shrew and Lady Macbeth, and Ophelia from Hamlet. Susanna Arroyan also created a version of Ophelia in polymer clay in the early 80s. And Lisa Lichtenfels, best known for her nylon-skinned, intricately sculpted batting dolls, did Ophelia in polymer clay in the late 80s. A Midsummer Night's Dream is one of Shakespeare's most popular plays. Stephanie Blythe did this porcelain group with Bottom, Titania, and the fairies. Bob McKinley also sculpted Bottom and Titania for the Tiffany windows. Puck has changed the actor's head into a donkey's and cast a spell, causing Titania to fall in love with him. The actor Nick Bottom catches many artists' imaginations. Deborah Pope created a needle-felted version of Bottom holding his donkey head. Susanna Royan's Bottom has grown donkey ears, but his entire face has not yet transformed. Nancy Walters' 1990 polymer clay Old Oberon, Titania's consort, stands 8 inches tall. Kyoko Naganishi's Oberon is washi paper. The artist is known as a national treasure in her native Japan and creates huge diorama installations featuring many washi paper dolls. About 1990, cloth doll artist Carla Thompson sculpted Oberon with the changeling child who was at the root of Titania and Oberon's argument. Carol Nordell sculpted the 9-inch polymer clay Oberon, Titania, the Queen of the Fairies, the troublesome practical joker Puck, who plays the role of Cupid and sets many of the play's events in motion, the 7-inch fairies Peas Blossom, Moth, and Cobweb. Although Shakespeare borrowed heavily from classic mythology, the correlations are most obvious in A Midsummer Night's Dream, where he uses human characters directly from Greek mythology and alludes to gods with the fairies. Also from Greek mythology, we have Artemis, one of the most revered of the deities. Lisa Lichtenfeld's 27-inch 1996 sculpture begins with underlying wire bones, then is built up with intricate layers of batting muscles, and finally covered in a nylon skin to create a highly realistic figure. Lisa's 1994 Medusa is a more sinister mythological being. With living venomous snakes for hair, she could turn mortals to stone when they gazed into her eyes. Medusa is 29 inches tall. Persephone, queen of the underworld, is 24 inches high seated. Lisa completed her in 1997. Marta Finch-Kozlowski's Persephone was sculpted in 1993 in polymer clay. Annie Wall's Be Careful What You Wish For in polymer clay was made for the 2013 NIADA Challenge, the golden one. King Midas' wish that everything he touched would turn to gold led to his downfall. Joellen Trilling sculpted Helen in Paris at home in the 1980s. She says she usually makes dolls paired with others because she sees the world in stories acted out by the figures. In Joellen's Romulus and Remus group from the 70s, the babies have polymer heads. Romulus and Mother 20 years later dates from the 1990s. Joellen's dolls are painted with acrylic paint all over, bodies, cloth, and bases, because she likes the way she can control the overall look with paint. In Leda and the Swan from the 80s, Leda also has a polymer head. Joellen occasionally made dolls using some polymer sculpts, but most of her work is all cloth with found objects. Branwen is a major protagonist in Britain's earliest prose literature compiled in the 11th century from the oral tradition by Welsh authors. Maggie Finch sculpted Branwen in cloth in 1994. Annie Wall's 12-inch tall St. George and the Dragon was made more for the fun of crafting the dragon as a boat, Annie says. Annie's St. George didn't slay the dragon, he tamed it and they went for a wild ride. Joellen Trilling's St. George didn't kill the dragon either. She says they're dancing and she thinks they're in love. Joellen's The Fox, the Crow, and the Hare sit on a settee with a back entwined with monkeys, antelope, lions, and other animals amid vines, and a violin in the shape of a rat. Annie Wall's animal-loving St. Francis has picked up a stick which magically plays music for the animals. Although St. Francis was a real person, he figures in many stories that may not have had any basis in actual events. There are some characters known mainly in their own countries of origin. Gwen Flather needle-sculpted American pioneer nurseryman Johnny Appleseed, who became a legend in his own time. Leslie Mullen has created dolls that derive from Japanese or Chinese folklore and myth. Kitsune is the Japanese word for fox, a common subject in Japanese folklore. They take on human form and have magical abilities that increase with age, allowing them to grow up to 9 tails. Kitsune has a doss stone clay head with head and body covered in silk crepe. She is dressed in woven prints and dupioni silks with an underskirt embellished with French knots. Her hat is rabbit with dupioni and hand-tipped ears, and her tail is fox and rabbit. The fish symbolizes a word for plenty in Chinese culture, and the fish is also a symbol for happiness, good luck, and abundance. Leslie's hats are an important feature in these dolls and tell the story. She wanted the fish to flow into the design, but have a burst of interest as it fans towards the back. She positioned the fish straight forward, with the tail blooming in the back of the hat. Stitches add together to create detail and a sense of movement, and Leslie finds the hand sewing a satisfying process. In Chinese culture, the butterfly is a symbol of the undying bond and also a symbol of happiness. Leslie created the butterflies in movement around the hat, and they are armatured and lined so that the wings are stable. The colors are midsummer deep in hue, and the fringy trim on the hat edge was chosen to mimic the shape of the butterfly. Leslie used pot de soie or silk satin, which is stiff and holds the embroidery well. The doll wears a story vest lined with the Japanese and the Roman characters. The Chinese dragon symbolizes good fortune, power, and strength. It is also a symbol of Mother Nature, the driving force of the earth, and the supreme being above all characters, as it is able to live in the seas, in the form of mountains, can fly up to the heavens, and can protect people against evil spirits. The hat is made in the traditional style with ornamentation of vintage Asian fabric, and the dragon's nose is Chinese silk brocade. Leslie dressed the dolls in this series predominantly in traditional black. They are approximately 18 inches in height. Grown in mud and muck, the lotus sinks under the water at night and must rise to the surface at dawn to bloom again. The lotus symbolizes purity of the heart and mind and represents long life, humility, honor, and tranquility. Leslie's doll, on a hot and crowded gallery night, landed face down on the tile floor when her pedestal was bumped. Leslie said when she found that the cheek was damaged, it was a time when all the grace she possessed needed to come to her, which it did. Leslie realized if she could fix her students' dolls, she could surely fix her own, and now the doll and her story live in a wonderful home. Elizabeth Fleuler Tomomichael was invited by a museum to create the characters in myth and legend of a village, Bosco Gurin, in the Swiss Alps. Some tales were about the Veltu, or wild ones who lived in a cavern and were smaller than ordinary people. The 19-inch Veltu father and 11-inch daughter were made in 2009. Like most of these figures, the heads and forearms are polymer clay, legs are air-drying clay, and the body's cloth over a wire armature. They are painted with acrylics, have glass eyes, and many of the costumes are felted. Other clothes are made from wool from the village sheep and fur from marmots hunted in the region. Objects like stones and cones were gathered there. Storks didn't bring babies in Bosco Gurin. They were left by the Veltu for the village midwife to find. These 5-inch babies are wrapped in washi paper, maple leaves, and hang inside the cavern. Bodies are poured papier-mâché and heads are sculpted in polymer clay. Legend has it that once a village child exclaimed that the Veltu's feet were twisted backwards, and that day the Veltu disappeared forever. Elizabeth did not sculpt the feet on these dolls, she ended the legs in snow. Elizabeth worked on this exhibit, creating 20 figures in all from 2008 to 2012. She felt the Veltu represented a parallel society which is tightly linked to nature. Also in Bosco Gurin folklore is the wicked gremlin Foulette, 25 inches tall, made in 2012. Since Foulette kidnapped and took people to the top of a mountain when they were sleeping, Elizabeth gave him wings from a pigeon. All that's known of the little man of Natcha is that he lived in a canyon and loved to frighten people. Elizabeth used blue to evoke water and white to remind us of the creek's spindrift. His coat is felted over chiffon. The 25-inch tall Tokchi applies pressure on people's chests, causing nightmares, depression, or homesickness. Elizabeth stumbled over a piece of wood on a walk, and the image began to take shape in her mind. Hair from an old broom, a glass eye, a single sculpted finger. From the Veltu, or Anazawava's Russian folk tales, and Leslie Molin's Japanese myths that we're not as familiar with, to classic stories we've known since childhood, like Maggie Iacona's Felt, Peter and the Wolf, or The Velveteen Rabbit, R. John Wright's Raggedy Ann and Andy, and their owner Marcella, Robert McKinley's Shakespearean characters, Maggie Head Kane's Tom Sawyer, and Catherine Walmsley's Punchinello, and still more characters once created but not available in photos. NIADA artists have produced a wealth of dolls from books, poems, and now recorded oral traditions spanning over half a century.